High school was supposed to be a chapter of ordinary teenage memories, dances in gymnasiums lit by fairy lights, whispered secrets in crowded cafeterias, and the unshakable certainty that life would stretch on endlessly, unremarkable and safe. But for me, those years were marked by a story so surreal, so tangled in coincidence and revelation, that it felt more like the plot of a novel than the reality I lived. It began in the autumn of my junior year, the kind of crisp, golden season that seemed to wrap the world in warmth. My best friend, Clara, had recently joined the drama club and raved about the theater director, Mr. Alcott. She described him as charming, intelligent, and unusually kind. He had a way of making everyone feel seen, she said, like they mattered in a world that often dismissed the voices of teenagers. One day, Clara insisted I meet him, claiming he could help with my growing interest in creative writing. She was always pushing me to step out of my comfort zone, and reluctantly, I agreed. The first time I walked into the dimly lit auditorium to meet Mr. Alcott, I was struck by his presence. He wasn't the imposing figure I'd imagined, but rather a man who seemed almost ordinary at first glance. Yet there was something in his gaze, a quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away. His eyes lingered on me, not in a way that felt inappropriate but as though he was searching for something even I didn't know was there. Our initial meeting was brief. Clara introduced us, and Mr. Alcott asked me a few questions about my writing. His voice was warm, his interest genuine, and I found myself opening up about my aspirations without hesitation. By the end of our conversation, he offered to mentor me, to help me refine my stories and find my voice. His offer felt like a gift, and I accepted it eagerly, unaware of the path it would set me on. Over the weeks that followed, Mr. Alcott became a constant presence in my life. He gave me books that opened my mind to new ideas, stayed late after school to workshop my writing, and even surprised me with a beautiful leather journal for my birthday. His kindness felt like sunlight in a shadowed world, and I began to rely on his guidance in ways I hadn't expected. My classmates joked that he was my writing guru, but to me, he was something far more. He was the first adult who seemed to see me as more than just another teenager. One evening, as the last traces of sunlight bled into the horizon, Mr. Alcott asked if we could talk. We sat on the edge of the stage, the vast emptiness of the auditorium stretching out before us. His expression was solemn, his usual light-hearted demeanor replaced with something heavier. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but low, "I need to tell you something important. You've become very special to me over these months. More than just a student. I see so much potential in you, so much brilliance. And I've grown to care about you deeply." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on me. My heart raced as confusion and disbelief collided. Was this admiration? Affection? Something more? Before I could respond, he added, "You're old enough to understand that sometimes connections go beyond conventional boundaries. I want to be part of your life, your future. In a more meaningful way." I was stunned. My mind scrambled for clarity, but the room seemed to spin. Mr. Alcott's sincerity was evident, but I couldn't ignore the unease bubbling beneath the surface. I managed a shaky nod, unsure of what to say, and he smiled as though my silence was agreement. Later that night, I lay awake, the events replaying in my mind. His words had unsettled me, but I couldn't deny the care and support he'd shown me. Was this just an unconventional friendship, or was there something more complicated at play? I decided to confide in Clara, hoping her perspective would bring clarity. Clara listened intently, her brow furrowing as I recounted the conversation. When I finished, she hesitated before speaking. "Emma, this sounds strange. I mean, he's been amazing to you, but maybe you should talk to your mom about it." Just to get her advice. The thought of involving my mother felt daunting. She had always been protective, and I worried she might misinterpret the situation. But Clara's concern lingered in my mind, and eventually, I decided she was right. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, I told my mother everything. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her face paled, and her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you say his name was?" "Mr. Alcott," I replied, confused by her intensity. Her eyes filled with a mix of dread and disbelief. This can't be happening. "Emma, I need you to stay away from him. Promise me. Don't go back to the theater, don't talk to him, nothing. Do you understand?" I was taken aback by her urgency. "Mom, what's going on? Why are you reacting like this?" She hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "Because Mr. Alcott isn't just your teacher. He's your father." The words hit me like a freight train. My father? The man I'd never met, the shadowy figure my mother rarely spoke of? It was impossible. And yet, as she explained, the pieces began to fall into place. She recounted their brief relationship, how she'd discovered she was pregnant after they had parted ways, and how she'd chosen to raise me alone. She'd kept his identity a secret, fearing the complications his presence might bring. But now, fate had brought him back into our lives in the most bewildering way. I didn't know how to process the revelation. Anger, confusion, and betrayal surged within me. How could he not have known? How could my mother have kept this from me? And how could I reconcile the man who had mentored me with the man who was, apparently, my father? The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Mr. Alcott, my father, reached out, desperate to explain. He claimed he'd had no idea about my existence and that his feelings toward me had been born of ignorance, not malice. He wanted to build a relationship, to make up for the lost years, but I couldn't face him. The weight of our tangled history was too much to bear. It was my mother who eventually convinced me to give him a chance. "Emma," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Whatever mistakes I made, you deserve to know your father. Don't let my fear rob you of that opportunity." Reluctantly, I agreed to meet him, this time not as a mentor but as the man who had unknowingly shaped my life from a distance. Our first meeting was fraught with tension, but as we talked, I saw a side of him I hadn't known before. He shared stories of his past, his regrets, and his hope for a future where we could be father and daughter. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let him in. Rebuilding our relationship was a journey filled with challenges. There were moments of joy like discovering our shared love of literature and art, but also moments of pain as we confronted the years we'd lost. My mother's role in our reunion was equally complex. She struggled to navigate her own emotions while supporting my efforts to connect with my father. Together, we forged a new family dynamic, one built on honesty and a shared commitment to healing. As time passed, the wounds began to mend. My father became a constant in my life, attending my graduation, cheering me on at my first writing competition, and even helping me choose colleges. Our bond grew stronger with each shared experience, and though our story's beginning was unconventional, it became a testament to the resilience of love and the power of forgiveness. Looking back, I'm still amazed by the twists and turns that brought us together. Life is unpredictable, often messy, but it's in those moments of chaos that we find our greatest opportunities for growth. My journey with my father taught me to embrace the unexpected and to seek connection even in the face of uncertainty. Our story is far from over, but it's one I'll cherish for the rest of my life.